Hello, thank you to the people who have come to see us in person, and to everybody watching online on YouTube and Facebook. My name is Eliyahu Gasson. I'm the president of the Duquesne chapter of the SPJ and the director for tonight's show. I'm just going to open things up real quick, just explain what the SPJ is. The SPJ is the oldest organization representing journalists in the United States. The SPJ advocates for good and ethical journalism and freedom of speech and the press in line with the First Amendment. Our members have a strong belief that public engagement is the forerunner of justice and the foundation of democracy. The SPJ adhere to a code of ethics to fulfill our goals. Those codes are: 1, to seek the truth and report it. Ethical journalism should be accurate and fair. Journalists should be honest and courageous in gathering, reporting, and interpreting information. 2, minimize harm. Ethical journalism treats sources, subjects, colleagues, and members of the public as human beings deserving of respect. 3, act independently. The highest and primary obligation of ethical journalism is to serve the public. And 4, be accountable and transparent. Ethical journalism means taking responsibility for one's work and explaining one's decisions to the public. Our chapter's purpose at Duquesne is to instill this code of ethics in ourselves and our peers. We hold events on and off campus. Our First Amendment Free Food Festival highlights the importance of freedom of speech and expression. Our newsroom tours around the city show students how professional newsrooms operate. And our speaker events, like this one, allow students to learn from professionals working in media. I'd like to thank Don Ma and Dr. Walk for providing invaluable feedback throughout the planning of this event, the DSTV crew for letting us use this studio and helping us out with the technical side of things, and to the 3 journalists here tonight who graciously agreed to participate. We do have snacks for you during intermission and after the show if you would like to stick around for a bit longer. We also have media department t-shirts for sale, the proceeds of which go toward paying our membership dues to the local and national SPJ. And now I'd like to introduce our moderator for tonight and treasurer of the SPJ, Zach Petrov.
Good evening. The Duquesne chapter of the Society of Professional Journalism, after a short hiatus, welcomes back the tradition of encouraging the free practice of journalism and stimulating high standards of ethical behavior. Tonight we're going to return to form as we continue to promote events and efforts to promote the discourse on important issues surrounding journalism and media. Higher education institutes are not only a place to hone our craft, but a crucial avenue to allow fresh perspectives, challenge the status quo, and hold those in and out of the media accountable. Full disclosure, I did use ChatGPT to get this speech ready. So, on behalf of the Duquesne chapter of the Society of Professional Journalism, again, we would like to thank the media department, the DSTV, Don Mall, our faculty advisor, Dr. Walk, everybody in the audience, and the students that may be forced to watch us via Zoom. We hope that you guys get all the extra credit that you deserve. And of course, we would like to extend our dearest thanks to our panelists here who are going to give a short introduction here momentarily. We know it's Passover. We also know it's the last day of classes after the break. So again, the SPJ just really wants to reiterate the appreciation we have for everybody taking out their time to be part of this event. We believe that this is a very important issue, and despite maybe some of the certain rhetoric, it's not an issue that is going away anytime soon. Tonight's panel is going to address the melting glacier in the room, if you will, about climate change. Our theme tonight is the state of environmental journalism in the Pittsburgh region. Tonight's speakers, who, like I said, are going to give a brief introduction in a few moments, are esteemed reporters in the field that are providing groundbreaking stories to show the devastating impact that climate change is having, not only on a global stage, but how it affects us locally. Tonight we have the opportunity and the privilege to pick the brains of the journalists that are telling important stories and in some unique ways, I may add, and how and shed light on important issues that need to be addressed. We're going to start off tonight's panel. Like I said, we're going to give some brief introductions. Then we're going to throw out some general questions. We're going to start with the overall picture, focus it on the local, and then we're going to talk about the Gen Zs and how it affects them and their role as future journalists with these environmental issues that are occurring in journalism. Should be pretty laid back evening. We're not expecting any fights or anything like that. After about an hour, we're going to have a short intermission, about 10 minutes. We'll come back, and then we're going to take questions from viewers, anybody in the audience that submitted questions, and we'll go from there. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first panelist, Kara. She's from the Allegheny front. If you'd like to tell the audience a little bit about yourself.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm Kara Holsopple. I'm the host and a producer with the Allegheny Front, which is a small nonprofit news organization that covers the environment in mostly Western Pennsylvania. It's been on the air for over 30 years in one form or another. I haven't been around that long with the show. I've been working there for about 10 years and as the host for about 6 years. And we cover everything from industry, pollution, wildlife to outdoor recreation, anything that has to do with the environment. I'm the host, as I said, of the show. It's a half-hour weekly show that's broadcast on the local NPR station here in Pittsburgh, but also in Central Pennsylvania State College, Harrisburg, and a little station in New York. We also have 2 full-time reporters and our executive producer who does fundraising and all kinds of other things for the show. So it's a very small crew.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Quinn?
Yeah, my name is Quinn Glabicki. I'm the climate and environment reporter and also a photographer with Public Source. We're also a nonprofit newsroom here in Pittsburgh. Most of our work is focused on Allegheny County, although on occasion that extends to more regional stories, regional issues such as energy and that sort of thing. Yeah, I've been there since June, and like I said, I'm a photographer, so a lot of my work is visual and blends a lot of different mediums.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And last but certainly not least, Oliver?
Hi, thanks for having me. My name's Oliver Morrison, and I've been a reporter for about 10 years. I'm originally from Seattle and not from Pittsburgh. I'm also, journalism wasn't my first career. I used to be a middle and high school teacher for 7 years, and I switched into journalism. I currently am a general assignment reporter for 90.5 WESA, so I do a lot of work in radio, but we also have a very active website. But I've also worked at Public Source in Pittsburgh for about 4.5 years, where I did the most of my environmental reporting, but I've kind of done it throughout my career. Yeah, I'm looking forward to the conversation tonight.
Perfect. Thank you guys so much. So, we're just going to jump right into it. Feel free to, chime in whenever you want. The first question that we're going to pose to the panel is, what are some of the most significant issues you see in the next, 1, 5 to 10 years?
Go ahead.
Well, I guess in 10 years, that would be 2033. And we'll have a pretty good sense of how hot the Earth is going to be coming up by 2033. We're supposed to reduce our carbon emissions, I think, by 50% by 2030, I think, is the goal if we're going to stay under 2 degrees Celsius. So that would be one of the things on the 10-year horizon, I think, that you would be looking out for. We could kind of expand.
Yeah, I think tied into that, too, is our regional energy future is really going to be coming to a head here in the next, like you said, in that time frame, within the next 10 years. There's a lot of decisions that need to be made about which new technologies we're going to be investing in nationally and regionally as well. We have a long history of fossil fuels in this region, most recently with natural gas, and now we're trying to decide collectively how to move forward through decarbonization and how to power our future.
I would say those are great answers. And plastic pollution. the production of plastic, which has recently come to our region through the petrochemical plant in Beaver County, which is fueled by fossil fuels, and then the plastic that it produces, it and other types of plants produce, and how that most plastic isn't recycled. Only 10% of plastic is recycled globally. What are we going to do with all that plastic? How does it impact the chemicals in it, impact our bodies, wildlife? And there's all kinds of ideas about how to recycle it, new technologies to recycle it. They're really unproven, and some of them are pretty high intensity for carbon emissions themselves. So I would say that plastic pollution, I think a lot of people are calling it the plastic crisis, is something that I would be looking at for more than 10 years.
One other thing, I just since I don't think anyone spoke on the 1-year timeline, could be interesting is we have a county executive race. There's a primary election coming in May, and one of the candidates, Sarah Innamorato, has sort of built one of her reputations on being very progressive on the environment, and she's supposedly one of the 3 leading candidates. So if she were to be elected in May, come this time next year, it would be very interesting to see what kind of environmental agenda the county takes on.
That's excellent. That's perfect. Thank you. The next question. How strong is the culture of non-compliance, specifically, not specifically, but I guess we're asking in the oil and gas industry, and what can be done about it? It's a tough one.
You know, one of the things I think that is actually true about the environmental reporting in our region is that there's a lot. I worked in Kansas for a couple years for a newspaper, and it was the biggest newspaper in Kansas, and there were no environmental reporters in the entire state. So when I moved here in 2017 and found the Allegheny Front and Public Source and Post-Gazette, and there was like we have 6 or 7 really good environmental reporters in our region, and a couple really specialize us. Two of the best people to answer that question, Reed Fraser and Anya Litvak, are not here tonight. That would be able to more directly, be able to talk about the compliance issues around natural gas in our region. But so I follow those issues, but not as closely. We know there are explosions. We know one of the biggest issues is there's a lot of methane that is leaking out of wells, and that's having a huge climate impact. We know that there are fines being given out, but I don't think that I could say more granularly than that.
Yeah, and I actually talked to a reporter from the Pittsburgh Union Progress, which is the reporters who are on strike at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, and one of their reporters did a story about noncompliance in a conventional oil and gas industry, which is like a different industry than the hydraulic fracking industry that a lot of people think of when they think of oil and gas in Pennsylvania. This is like an industry that's been around for over 100 years in the state. People always think of it as like a mom and pop. They're smaller, but actually some of them are owned by really big corporations. And there was a report recently, I think it was a report by the Department of Environmental Protection, about a lot of non-compliance with, I'm not exactly sure all of the different categories, but basically a lot of people in that industry are just doing whatever they want. And those wells also produce methane, and even though they're smaller, and sometimes some of them are abandoned, we don't even know where they are. They were abandoned by the companies that started them 100 years ago. So that's an issue that we've looked at recently. A lot of the things that I do are 2 ways with other reporters, like these reporters and other fine reporters in the region, about what they're working on, and that was a story that we looked at.
Absolutely.
One thing I'd say is that we have a new governor now as well, who's historically been vocal about holding the oil and gas industry to account. It remains to be seen how robust that response is going to be. But if we're talking about non-compliance, I think it's also important to mention that there is kind of there are certain things that are being done within that industry that there are not laws to protect against. So it's not technically non-compliance, but they are nonetheless things that a lot of community groups and local residents, particularly in Washington and Greene County, are dealing with on a daily basis that are not technically out of compliance or against some regulation, but they might not be covered by that. They might be a gray zone, or there might be a loophole that allows these activities to continue.
One other thing I'll add is that, and I'm sure we'll talk about this a lot tonight, but it's sort of impossible to separate these sort of environmental issues from politics a lot of the time. So when I was living in Wichita, Kansas back in like 2016, it was a not infrequent occurrence, surprisingly frequent occurrence, that I would be woken up in my bed from pictures shaking on the wall because of earthquakes. And the reason was at that time there was fracking wells, mostly in Oklahoma, but some in south central Kansas, that were injecting just huge amounts of water. There was these wells were what are called wet wells. They produced just a lot of waste for every bit of oil and natural gas that they were generating, and so that meant they were just pumping like, I forget the quantities, but large quantities of fracking waste into the ground, into the rock. And what was happening was that it was causing the earth to shake. I've visited people whose houses had like cracks in them, where like I remember one guy at what do you call it? A giant animal who he had shot and killed. He had the head on his mantle had fallen off. Plates were flying everywhere. And so I think I'm coming around to the point here is that like that happened very rapidly. Went from like almost no earthquakes. You don't think of Oklahoma, Kansas being an earthquake area, to like several earthquakes a day, and big earthquakes like over 5.0. And what happened was you had this is like a pejorative term, but like suburban moms were suddenly caring about this issue. And it became an issue that like even politicians in Oklahoma who, are typically more pro-oil than pro-environment, I would say, had to care about because, their constituents were really upset about this issue. And so I think, to the extent that there have been times in Pennsylvania where people have been really worried a lot about fracking issues, and it seems like there have been some responses, but I don't know. I feel like where we're at right now is it's not as prominent an issue politically right now, so maybe that it's not getting as much traction currently. But there is, I know there was just a bunch of money that was allocated to trying to cap some of these methane emissions that recently is starting to be dispersed. But
Yeah, I would say it depends on where you live. I'm thinking about the Mariner East pipeline, which is a pipeline that carries natural gas from our part of the state to Philadelphia for export to Europe. And many people who live along the pipeline route, they experienced all kinds of issues with water contamination. And the company was fined, but it's a pretty small fine for a huge company. And so they just kept going. So while they're sort of, whenever they do violate the Clean Streams law in Pennsylvania, they are held accountable, but it's not like it stops the activity. They're just going to keep going forward because a fine is not really that much of a slap on the wrist for them.
I'd also point out that there are a number of recent introductions or proposals that are likely to really impact that conversation when it comes to natural gas, whether that is the coming online late last year of the cracker plant in Beaver County, or this proposal that's been backed by a lot of state, federal, and even local and regional politicians, policymakers for a hydrogen hub that would also really expand the amount of natural gas that our region would be producing.
And introducing a whole new set of pipelines,
Yeah.
different kind of pipelines with different kinds of safety concerns in our region, which is new for us. That's something that's happening in other parts of the country for different types of industry. But
Excellent. Thank you, guys. Okay, so, and you guys all have different styles of reporting and how you do it, but how do you know, which agencies are quote unquote for real and which ones are kind of just towing the company line? And that includes activist groups as well, Is there a way to tell who is serious and who is just kind of looking to just appear like they care about environmental issues?
I'm sorry, did you say agencies?
Agencies and not to exclude activist groups.
Like regulators?
Sure, absolutely.
Or like corporations or?
any and all. But I think when we wrote the question, I think we were more specific about corporations, right? How do you know when a company, is there a way to tell when a company's saying, oh yeah, we care about environmental issues, we're going to switch things up, and then they don't do? Is there a telltale sign, or how as journalists do you navigate that field?
I was going to say, you can tell I'm more comfortable asking questions. So I'm answering questions, because that's, I think, asking questions is one way that we do that is, you know, I don't know. I'm sorry, go ahead, you guys.
I mean, I guess I think it's important to establish what our role and limitation is, and let me get around to answering your question. I think when she says we're asking questions, we don't ever get to look into the hearts and minds of any person or company. What we do is we get to present, we talk to people, we share what they say, we look for information, we share that information, and we try to build, patterns of behavior, things like that, and we try to prove particular cases. So in my mind, there are particular groups or particular agencies who I do feel like I'm impressed by maybe the results they get or the deliberateness with which they stay with issues over years and the impact that they're able to have. And I can say I have personal favorites, I guess, or things that stylistically are interesting to me. But I think it's just, me personally, if I were it's sort of beyond the journalism, I think it's possible to be an evil corporation who's making lots of money and also care about the environment. That person probably, I think a lot of them do on some level care about the environment. That doesn't mean that, as journalists, we don't, try to hold them to account and push them further and in ways we do. And also, I think also our job as journalists, and certainly in my job has been as a mainstream publication, maybe, and I'm not sure if Kara feels differently about this, working for a publication that focuses on the environment, but I think it is also important to represent other concerns besides environmental concerns, even when I'm an environmental reporter, and give them due weight. Economic considerations are not unimportant, political considerations are not unimportant. Quality of life things, I could go on. And so, there are some bad actors for sure, but a lot of times you're more it's more, there's some arguments over here, there's some arguments over here, and these arguments maybe don't, are not prioritizing the environment, but they're not necessarily illegitimate.
I was just going to say, I feel like it's always my job to ask the questions, to get the story that our audience deserves to hear or needs to hear or wants to hear. So I'm sort of standing in for the people who are be listening to our show. And so, we never really take anybody at face value. Whatever people say to us, we still have to sort of look into it, see what other people are saying. We get a study maybe, and we look at it. We talk to the study author, but then we talk to somebody else, another scientist, to say, hey, what do you think about this? I'm not sure. I'm not trying to understand this. What's your other people in your field saying about this? To give one example of a type of people that we often talk to is researchers, scientists. So we're not really ever taking anybody at face value, even people who are activists or who have a stake in, an environmental, even a disaster that's happened in their area. We have to listen to what they have to say, and they're people on the ground, but we still have to sort of look into what they're saying and make sure that they have their facts straight and that they're, find out where they're coming from. So I don't know if that answers your question, but what did you want to say?
I would just say that, I think journalism as a practice has gone through an evolution when it comes to climate, as far as, there was a period of time where journalists were giving a lot of credence to both sides when it comes to climate. And I think that mostly a lot of publications have gone past that, where we're no longer giving space on our pages to climate denialism. So, that's a pretty, glaring red flag for me whenever someone is questioning pretty, factual climate science and disputing that. There can be, certainly shades of gray in there, but there is, we are in a climate crisis. Things are changing. We have to address that. And I think when people start to, when sources are trying to make arguments that run counter to what, most scientists, by and large, agree upon, I think that's where, you can kind of tell where people stand. One thing that Oliver said earlier reminded me that, like, I think too, going back in this region, like, there is and continues still to be now, like a mismatch in incentives between, for example, like fossil fuel and making money and climate goals. And now I think one of the struggles among climate researchers or economists is how to align those incentives so that it's actually in the best interest for those corporations to get on the climate, solutions train and actually like make those profitable, because that's really what's going to press them to do that.
I mean, oh, go ahead, I'm sorry.
No.
Well, I was just going to say there's also something, like corporate greenwashing, where these big corporations have a page on their website about what they're doing about the climate and organizations they've donated money to. And a lot of that involves technical jargon sometimes for industries, like for recycling, plastic recycling. There's this thing called advanced recycling. That's what the industry calls it. It's really using chemicals to recycle plastic, or maybe not even recycle it to use it as plastic, use it as something else like fuel. So you have to kind of like take a look at something like that and they're like, what is advanced recycling? Like, what is that? And so, so if something sort of, you don't know, I don't know a lot of things. So I don't even have to pretend like I don't, like I'm acting for the audience and they don't know because I don't know. And so a lot of times something will come up like that and you'll think, I'm not really sure what that means. What does that really mean? And then that kind of helps you get sort of behind what some of these terms mean and what they, I don't know if I would say it's like a bad actor or whatever, it's business, but it sort of gets you sort of behind the wall of jargon. There's a lot of jargon in environmental journalism that for any industry. So that's something that people can hide behind unless you know how to ask questions about it.
The word clean sticks out to me as one that's like often attached to something with industry. It's like, oh, we're going to do this clean, but clean doesn't necessarily mean, it's very ambiguous what that means. It could mean cleaner, but doesn't necessarily mean zero carbon. It doesn't mean low carbon. So that's a word that I'm always, when I hear clean energy, I'm always like, what do you actually mean by that?
I've been sort of trying to studiously avoid like calling anyone out in particular, but I feel like there is one. I will call out one bad actor. Not actually, bad actor is not the right phrase, but an actor who has over a long period of time consistently like promoted climate denialism and efforts to deny climate change, and that is like the Koch brothers. I guess there's only one that is surviving now, but that one of them lived in Wichita, Kansas, where I lived, and there's the only time I've covered them here is in Pittsburgh, is they fund a department at the University of Pittsburgh, and I think that given their long history and sometimes ways they've tried to obfuscate their work, but they make money on the issue. They have a long history of paying for people that obscure the science around climate change. And so, like, I thought it was newsworthy when someone said that there was a department being funded by them to try and at least look into what they were doing. And, those people, they didn't want to talk to me, the people doing the department. One of them does work in Afghanistan that seems like very interesting. Another one does sort of free market, sort of abstract stuff. So it's maybe like not smoking gun kind of stuff that is going to like immediately have a negative impact on Pittsburgh, but they didn't want to talk about it because that it's clear that where that money has come from and where a lot of that money has gone to. And so I think that after you've established that long of a track record, I think it's fair to give that company and those foundations like extra scrutiny for everything that they're doing.
Absolutely. Thank you. Guys, we're going to kind of switch gears and we're going to kind of focus on the local scope, really hit into here. So let's start out there. How do environmental issues affect local communities? Examples like landslides, fracking, shell cracker plants, things of that nature.
How don't they impact local communities? I mean, I don't know what you guys want. You want to take an industry?
Yeah, pick a card.
You
I mean-
oh, go ahead.
Yeah, go.
You spend a lot of time in Clareton. You want to talk about some of
Yeah.
your work out there?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, air quality in Allegheny County is one of the biggest environmental issues. Oliver mentioned the Allegheny County executive race. I think that's going to be a big issue in the primary. And yeah, it's one that, like, I mean, we've been dealing with that for over a century as a region. And I think one of the, well, I could talk about this all day, but I think one of the things that sticks out to me is, like, you know, every time I talk to, like, an older person who's been around for a while, they'll always say, you know, it's better than it used to be. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it is acceptable or healthy or, you know, not impacting the lives of residents on a daily basis. I spent a lot of time, a year in Clareton, reporting there and photographing, and, you know, basically, you know, there are a certain number of residents that, like, really feel it on daily basis. People with pre-existing conditions like asthma, and then when you start talking about, you know, weather events like inversions that, like, really concentrate pollution in these communities, and particularly in the Mon Valley, like, you know, people don't go outside for a day, sometimes 3 days. And obviously that can be very disruptive. You can imagine a situation where, you know, a kid with asthma is not going outside to go to school, and they get back in behind their schoolwork, and, you know, that kind of starts a revolving cycle. But so I think too, with these conversations, it's really important to recognize, like, the industrial, like, legacy that exists in our region, especially when it comes to steelmaking, and especially in the Mon Valley. Like, one person, I was standing with them, and they said, like, do you smell that? And I was like, yeah, it smelled like, you know, hydrogen sulfide. And they were like, no, like, that smells like money. And so I think it's really important to recognize, like, what these industries have historically meant for these communities and how that has changed over time. You know, there are multi-generational families that have relied on this for their livelihood for, you know, generations. You know, their great-grandfathers and, you know, their whole family has worked in the steel mill. But now that is really changing, and the future of that industry is in question. Yeah.
I don't remember if you said the Clareton Coke Works is in Clareton. Did you say that?
I don't think I did.
Oh,
Yeah.
the Clareton Coke Works is the huge plant that he was talking about. It's the largest coke making facility, maybe in North America, definitely in the
North
U.S. And it's had a long history of violations, fines, you name it. Most recently, there's a settlement with the Allegheny County Health Department and two environmental groups for a fire that happened there in 2018, on Christmas Eve on 2018. And it knocked out their pollution controls for almost 4 months. And people in Allegheny County, and most importantly in Clareton, were breathing in air that wasn't being, you know, didn't have the correct pollution controls. And so there's a settlement happening now about that. But, and I think my colleague Reed Frazier said that it was like, before the Clean Air Act happened. Like, that's what the air was like there. That's what it was. Everybody got a little taste of what it was like before 1970. So anyway,
Yeah.
my 2 cents there.
One of the things, because I feel like we need to talk about East Palestine at
For
some
sure.
point.
Oh,
It's
yes.
been in the
Oliver's
news
been reporting
recently.
in East Palestine.
I mean, in East Palestine, but I was thinking about that. What made me think about that is that the reason that fire happened was there quite a lot of evidence that they were cutting a lot of jobs at the plant. They hadn't been doing inspections. So, like, the way the fire started was there was a leak on the roof of this one building, and the leak over many years corroded away a piece of metal that held up a piece of pipe that would, if there was a fire in the plant, would help put out the fire. But instead, the metal corroded away, so that pipe, like, fell and broke a bunch of things, and it was a very long, convoluted process. But there were several backup systems that were supposed to have gone into effect to have prevented that fire. All of them failed, and there was evidence that they, you know, hadn't been inspected. So it was just like series of unfortunate events, catastrophic failure that at the root of it was a company that was struggling economically, trying to save money, trying to cut costs, and ultimately the people in the community suffered. I think there was a history, I think like asthma visits to emergency rooms like doubled over that period. So anyways, I think it was funny. I was just thinking there was a New York Times story, and we've done some reporting on this in East Palestine a little bit as well, but talking about the train company, Norfolk Southern, that over the past, I think it was since 2012, has cut its workforce by like 40%. It was the largest cut in workforce among the major railroads in the country, and it also had like a 90% increase in like derailments and accidents during this period. And so, like, although was very unusual how bad the derailment was in East Palestine, like I think the commonality here is that wouldn't be that unexpected. It's not like one for one cause and cause, like this person was not fired, like that's not the cause of this derailment. It was like a bearing on a car. But like if you were going to point to a particular time when something like this could happen with a particular company, these coincidences I think are important to look at. So I've been up in East Palestine a number of times in the last couple months as that community has been dealing with a lot of health issues that they claim. There's a lot of confusing information right now about exactly what what their health risks are. We know there's contamination in the water, some in the soil, but it's unclear. The official water tests and the official air tests sort of show that it's not exceeding any thresholds. But there's some scientists up there doing additional research. But a lot of people have been showing like unusual symptoms. People talking about getting like nosebleeds that have never had nosebleeds and things like that. So that's another example of of where the environment impacts people. Those were. But we could probably go on and on because pretty much every story has
everything. Well, I wanted to talk a little bit about fracking because I do feel like we let the fracking industry off the hook a little bit when we're talking about compliance issues because, fracking came to Pennsylvania, it's like 12 years ago, 13 years ago, I don't know, like something like that, very quickly, and the regulation sort of had to catch up with the industry. There were just like, all of a sudden there were all these wells in different parts of the state to drill down at the Marcellus Shale layer. And but since it started, or maybe like a year or two after it started, people have been reporting health impacts, all kinds of different things, nosebleeds, people who live near fracking activity. There's all different kinds of fracking activity too. There's well pads, there's compressor stations that compress the gas, they're very loud. There's truck traffic, and some of the regulations have tried to address those concerns. But there was like a compendium of health studies that, I don't know how many years they've been doing that, but hundreds of studies about the health impacts for people who live near fracking activity in different parts of Pennsylvania. I'm thinking of one a couple of years ago that children who are born with, I think it's a half mile of fracking wells, have a higher risk of low birth weight. And that's just one study. There's lots and lots of other studies. It's been really hard to prove health impacts are caused by certain types of activity. Similarly, a lot of people have said that they had their well water impacted, or and those have also been very difficult to prove. There have been private settlements between companies and people, so we don't even know the extent of that. But I just wanted to mention the fracking industry a little bit because that's something. And again, I don't cover that. That's not my beat. My colleague Reed Frazier and Julie Grant, who actually covers mostly Eastern Ohio, cover those issues more closely than I do, but I just wanted to mention that.
There's also that really great book. I mean, in addition to their work, Amity and Prosperity won the Pulitzer a few years ago, and it's awesome description of a couple of towns that were very impacted by the fracking industry.
In Washington County, which is has the most well pads of any county in Pennsylvania.
Excellent.
Chris Olding,
Yeah, I talked to her.
And I think you guys have answered this already, but I still want to ask it just so we can hit it. What can we expect to see if these trajectories continue? Again, not on a global scale, but the impact in our communities, our local communities.
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
Of course. What can we expect to see if these trajectories continue, not just on a global scale, but the impact on our communities?
Yeah. I mean, I think, I'm sorry. The impact that the Shell cracker facility has, I mean, it's only been open for not even a year yet, right?
Barely 6 months.
It's already exceeded its pollution permits a couple of times at least. And, you know, you were talking about it needs to be fed by natural gas, and we're not really sure like how that's all going to pan out, or what the industry like wants. Like they were talking about building a couple of other of these facilities, and I don't know if you guys have been out to. I'm sure you've been out to the cracker site. It was on a site that was already an industrial site, but it doesn't really tell you what the magnitude of it is. I mean, it's almost like its own little city. Yeah. It's huge, and it's like built right next to where people live and shop and go to the doctor, I think we're just sort of. I feel like I was thinking about this a couple of months ago when when there was a flare there and there was some activity and people were concerned, and I was thinking this is like the Claire Coke works of like our lifetime. Like we're at the beginning of something that's going to be we're going to be reporting on this forever, and I don't know where it's going, but.
I think the thing that sticks out to me about the cracker plant, right, is like we've seen this long history of violations from facilities like the Claire Coke Works, for example. And that's a facility that was built in, I think, 1910. And then you have this facility, which is supposedly state-of-the-art, like you said, looks like a shiny metal city. And even that is violating its air permits within a few months of even opening. You know, that's an annual air permit. So they're blowing past that. So even like the new technologies, 100 years later, are not really able to keep these emissions under control. And I think going back to your original question of like what can we expect for the future, like how these progress really depend on like what we decide both as a nation, globally and regionally, like how are we going to fuel our future? If we decide that we are going to rely on natural gas, be it through direct energy as a direct energy source, or if it's powering hydrogen, or if it's creating plastic, if we decide that that is going to be one of our select fuels, then that's going to expand, I think, pretty dramatically. Yeah.
Yeah, so many things to talk about. I think one of the things we haven't talked about so much is just I think one of the big impacts in Pittsburgh as the climate warms is going to be on the water in the region, and that means more rainfall. Quinn's written a lot about how that means landslides in your basement. It means more backups. It means flooding. It means cars getting stuck in the road, unable to get to work. It means more potholes. It means a lot of the things we depend on to survive agriculturally are going to be put in jeopardy. It means that the rivers that we hope would be the centerpiece of our city and our tourism are still going to be dirty and polluted. And so I think and maybe I didn't spell it out explicitly, with the climate warming, there's expected to be more frequent, more intense rainstorms, and our infrastructure is not built to handle the storms that are already coming and are going to be coming. For those of you who were in 2018, 2019, we saw 2 of the 3 wettest years in the history, in more than 100 years here. The last 2 years have not been, as they've been about average, and so people, haven't been paying as much attention to it. But when you average it out, the trajectory is clear. More and more of those intense rains, and so that's just we're going to be living in that world. We know that the world is going to continue to warm for a while. It's not like nobody has a plan for it to stop warming like tomorrow. The hope is that we can stop emissions. I think by 2050 is kind of where everyone. I forget exactly how the models work. So hopefully that it would start declining or stop getting worse, I think, in 2050. But until then, expect more water coming into your basement.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up landslides, because that is like one of the, Pittsburgh is uniquely susceptible to landslides based on our topography and our geology. As far as nationally, it's one of the most landslide prone areas in the country. And I think in 2018 we had over 200 landslides between Allegheny and Westmoreland counties. So it's really an issue that I think flies under the radar until you are faced with a landslide either in your backyard or on your way to work or whatever. People don't really think about landslides impacting them until it does.
For this next section, we're going to focus on the student, kind of the Gen Z scope. So for this,
I'll defer to Quinn.
what kind of mental health aspects are we seeing coming about with the concerns or even lack of concerns when it comes to global climate change? How much of that is a factor that you guys are seeing in your work?
Well, my colleague Julie did a couple of stories, and we worked with Environmental Health News to talk about this very subject. And I'm trying to think about what she reported on, but I know, and I've also talked with the author Britt Ray, who does something called Gen Dread, I think it's called. It's like a newsletter and it's about that topic. And I think I remember interviewing her, and she was talking about, just, well, I don't know, it's complicated because, what we're all talking about here is it's hard. It's hard to report on these like very negative stories. Most of the stories we report on are pretty negative. One of our news partners, WITF, is trying to focus on climate solutions and solutions journalism, which is a different take on environmental journalism, which looks at responses to the problem and gets people thinking in that mode rather than like all of the problems themselves, getting people to think about the responses. It doesn't always mean the response like works, like the solutions work, but like why doesn't it work and how can we do things differently? And it sort of gets people out of the doom and gloom of it and into thinking more proactively about it. It doesn't make it better, but I think it can help people take in the problems and the enormity of the problem easier, and also feel like they have some sort of stake in some sort of way that they can act or think about these things that are less doom and gloom and for their futures. I don't know. Did I answer the question?
I think solutions journalism is like, with respect to climate, like, I do think it's very important to highlight these, efforts to address climate change and to increase our resiliency to that issue. But I also think it's important to be very skeptical whenever these solutions are being presented. I think I mentioned earlier, like this idea of like clean energy. Like clean energy can mean a lot of different things, and often it's presented as a solution, but in some cases those solutions are actually just continuations of the status quo, particularly when it comes to like the oil and gas industry, for example. So I just think that I would just peg the importance of skepticism and really like digging into what these mean and not taking it at face value.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't have much insight into Gen Z, unfortunately. I mean, my understanding is that they are more involved and care more about environmental issues than any other generation. I think that is true, and I think that maybe that's a result of the fact that we're just seeing these crazy billion-dollar damage storms, and it's sort of unavoidable at this point. So what I will say though is I don't have. I don't have my personal, and I did it for 4 years. I don't have a pessimistic outlook. I think if I were to speak to Gen Z, not trying to guess what they feel, I would say like this is a very exciting time to try and get involved and to choose a profession, because there's so many different professions that potentially could shape the future for the better. There's like engineers and teachers and scientists and all these, I'm trying to think like, you want to build a car, drive a car. There's like so many probably little things that could be done to make cars more beneficial. Psychologists to help people like choose the right bag. There's planes. There's certain industries we know that like need to become greener, and we don't know quite how best to do it. Like planes are one, cement are another. These huge industries that are really important. And so like I think figuring out if you're in the Gen Z, like what is exciting to you, there's probably a way that you can make that industry more environmentally friendly and make it better for, you know, your whole generation.
I mean, the youth climate movement is really inspirational to a lot of older generations, like the Sunrise Movement, Greta Thunberg, a lot of other, you know, youth climate activists. And I mean, so I think there is a lot of, I don't know if it's hope. I don't want, also don't want to speak for a generation that I don't belong to. But there are people to look to in that generation who are doing a lot of talking about these issues, looking forward, and, you know, have a lot of ideas about how to, I think when I was mentioned Britt Ray, she wrote this book called Gen Dread, and she was talking about to a lot of young people who don't want to have kids, who have a lot of trepidation about like where they want to go as adults. And one of her points is like adults just need to get out, like show some support, get off the couch, get out of the way, let young people sort of lead, and let, you know, older people have had their chance. It's time for these other people to sort of take positions of, you know, leadership.
Yeah, I think too, like, you know, we're talking in Pittsburgh, where, you know, our climate reality is not as dire as it is in much of the rest of the world. And so if you're talking about a generation that exists globally, right, there's many different places in which this generation is experiencing climate much more acutely than we are here. So, you know, I'm thinking of people that are migrants, or, you know, experiencing drought, or making like really intense decisions and journeys based on what's going on with the climate right now. I feel fortunate to live here and to be able to report on these things, but I'm also like, I think it's important that we like recognize that like how we experience climate here is not how most of the world's experiencing climate. And reporting on those stories, and also like highlighting those responses and that resilience to the issue can also be a source of inspiration or hope or solutions.
I think what Quinn is raising, like an important issue that hasn't come up yet, and maybe it's in your list of questions, but we should certainly talk about it if it's not, which is just that in the last 10 years, I feel like what it means to be an environmental journalist has really expanded to try to incorporate the life experiences of people who come from all kinds of different backgrounds. I would say this is like my stereotype, because I wasn't an environmental journalist 10 or 20 years ago, but that it tended to follow like maybe like white suburban moms and the sort of issues that they cared about. Whereas I think today there's like a lot of studies that show that a lot of like the people that are being impacted most in our community here in the country and globally are people who are more disproportionately poor, disproportionately people of color, and that so when we make choices about what stories we should cover or who we should talk to and what is worth reporting, I think we all try to make an effort to represent the environment in that more expanded view, because I think there was maybe a time where you didn't think about like the drinking water in the city of Chicago or Flint or whatever as like an environmental issue, but I think now I think in our profession that is the core of what what we do is to think about issues of equity while we're trying to talk about maybe scientific or things like that.
Guys, last question before we go into intermission. And I think, this is kind of a fun one. A lot of students will be going home to celebrate the Easter and Passover holidays. How would you advise students to convince that one uncle that doesn't believe in climate change?
I've done a couple of interviews about this, and I still don't know the answer. I think what most people have advised is sort of to relate what your concerns are, rather than putting it on the other person. I'm just trying to remember what I've been told. We've asked a number of psychologists and other people about this over the years, and I would say also over the years it's changed. Like I started asking this like 5 years ago, and now I feel like it's gotten more urgent. Like the people's reaction to it, and also just like the urgency of the issue, it just feels more hot, for lack of a better word. But I think that people have said to us is just sort of like, I am concerned about this issue. I don't know what you think about it, but here's why it matters to me, or why it, it's something why I can't sleep at night or whatever, and sort of being open to what they say. But you're not going to convince anybody with facts and figures, I don't think.
Yeah. Yeah, I think facts and figures have a place in reporting as far as being a factual basis for what we're presenting. But I as a photographer, I always try to focus on the human experience of how people are going about these issues in their daily lives, and I think that can be a very visceral way of someone to understand something that they likely aren't experiencing themselves, right? If you're a climate denier, it's likely you're not experiencing climate change firsthand. But when we can see that emotion on someone's face, or hear their words in audio journalism, hear their journey that they're going on, for example, or something like that, I think that has more of an emotional resonance with an audience, particularly people who haven't experienced that themselves.
I think my answer would be, unless your uncle is in a building trades union, I would wave that energy and time to try and focus on the union people in our area. I feel actually Reed, who works with Kara, did a really good story 5 years ago or something about just the way that the traditional political alliance that promotes environmental issues it's more typically Democrats, but in our area, they're kind of sometimes divided by some of the building trades unions who are getting work in some of the fossil fuel industries. And so I think there have been some efforts to try and create blue-green alliances or things that would push them in a more environmentally friendly direction. And so you don't have endless amount of time. Be strategic. I think there are. It seems like certain groups would have more leverage than others. Although if your uncle does work for head of one of these unions.
But your uncle probably does vote, maybe, hopefully.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
And, as Quinn was saying, these policy decisions, or people that we vote for are going to be making these decisions for our future, so.
Well, that concludes the first half of our panel discussion. We'll see you guys back here in about 10 minutes. Welcome back. We are here with our distinguished panel, and now we're going to enter the question and answer section. We've got some questions, a few questions submitted via the internet. So this is from Rochelle, hopefully I'm saying that right. Wow, so informative, and thank you for what you do. Your reporting is vital to keep us informed on everything and the issues in our area. A lot of times you have to bring us bad news. A lot of times you have to bring us bad news, understandably. What are some good stories or angles that you have been able to report on concerning Pittsburgh's environment?
Well, there's a ton of great nonprofits in the Pittsburgh region that are doing very interesting work. One thing I will share, though, since we've already talked about East Palestine, is I went up there a couple weeks ago just to kind of see how the children were responding to this catastrophe, disaster, environmental disaster in their area. And I ended up spending some time with some drama kids who were trying to put on a production of The Lion King Jr. And it was very interesting to just hear all of their different perspectives about, they'd lost rehearsal time. Some of them were having health symptoms. Some of them were not able to go to school anymore. But yet there was also a sense of we want to put on this show. We want to show the world that it's okay to be here, that we want to have our sports, and we want the other towns that might be afraid to come here to see that we can put on a good production, and the world's going to go on. And so I think so I guess that's an ordinary person kind of thing. I'll think of another example.
I don't have a concrete example of a positive story, but I think generally speaking, the moment that we're in presents, a lot of concern on a lot of different levels, like we've talked about, but it also presents a lot of opportunity to have a hand in shaping what our future is. And that should be encouraging, I think, to people, especially young people, who might be thinking of getting involved in these issues, whether that's through advocacy or, professional work, science, whatever that might be. This is a time when our future is really up in the air, as a city, as a region, but also as a, I don't know, maybe it's dramatic to say a species, but there's a lot that's going on that is able to be influenced, and I think that should be encouraging.
I can think of two things. We try to do positive story. I don't know positive, but just stories about the environment that are just about good things that are happening. Actually on the show this week, we're re-airing something that I did a couple of years ago. The Western Pennsylvania Conservancy created a new habitat for salamanders and frogs. We do wildlife stories out of at Ohio Powell State Park, I think, in Fayette County, and it's sort of this. It was this campus for, I think it was a mental health facility. So there's all this concrete and a lot of ruins of buildings, and they created this habitat called vernal pools, and that's a sort of a wetland that only when the snow melts and sort of creates little puddles and things, and that's where frogs and salamanders reproduce, and then they kind of dry up in the summertime when they become adults. And these habitats are disappearing across Pennsylvania, and so this was a story, and it has lots of great sound in it of squishing in the mud, and I got to see lots of little creatures that I don't normally get to see. So that was a fun story. And so we're re-airing that this week, if anyone wants to listen, on AlleghenyFront.org. And then last summer we did a collaboration, because we're such a small newsroom, we do a lot of collaborations with Soul Pit Media, which is, does all kinds of, they publish all kinds of different media for the Black community in Western Pennsylvania, I think mostly. And we did a series of tours of urban farms in Pittsburgh, and with one of their reporters, and I kind of helped produce the stories. And they were just really inspiring. People I'd never met before, people who are, growing food for their own communities, who have really interesting philosophies about growing food. And so that was like a kind of a feel-good story, even though there's a lot of aspects to it, but that was like something fun and uplifting.
This is from Bella. How do you tell the difference? Like, how do you draw the line between reporting and advocacy?
I don't think there's a single line, but there are a few aspects to the method of journalism, I think, that separate it from advocacy. One, I think, and you guys, if I'm forgetting something, you can chime in, is you have to seek the comment from everybody who has a stakeholder involved. And that doesn't mean you can put them into a context that seems the most truthful to you, but you have to try and present every perspective. And if you're an advocate, you don't have to do that. Maybe this is more debatable, but I think the sort of the mindset you have going in is like, I don't know, as a reporter, let's find out. Like, so you go in with a question, whereas I think as an advocate, you're kind of going in with an outcome in mind. What else am I missing?
Well, I think, generally speaking, when we're in the field reporting, we're standing in the back of the room as an observer. We're not participating in these conversations in the moment. Our reporting can help inform future conversations and hopefully, more truthful understandings of a situation among those who are debating it, but we're not ourselves participating in that debate or influencing that debate personally.
I think influencing is a good word. Like, we're not trying to push for an outcome, or whatever happens, and that's what we have to report about or learn about. We can't really, although we're framing the story and whatever, wherever we're coming from informs that. I mean, I was thinking what complicates that in environmental journalism is that we live in Allegheny County and we're breathing the air here too. And so you kind of have to, there's no way to take that out of the equation when we're thinking about these issues. So that's more like objectivity and not advocacy. But that's a whole other topic in journalism and how journalism is moving forward. But that's something I think about too. Is like, yeah, we're kind of looking at it as an observer, but a lot of times we have a stake in the story too that we're not talking about.
Yeah. One area where I think, too, it can be not tricky, but like when it comes to story selection and, what you're going to dig into, like that can often be perceived as bias, selection bias, for example. But, I think what informs that is often community input, community concerns, or, people reaching out and saying, hey, this is an issue that is impacting me on a personal level. So we're presenting the stories of people who are experiencing things and who have personal experience to share and want that information out there. We're not injecting our own experience as individuals into that story.
Excellent. All right, and this is our final online question. It's a three-parter, so, but this will be the final student question is, how did you get into environmental reporting? What drew you to this type of reporting, and what can journalism students do to better prepare them for this type of reporting?
Okay, I'll start with that. I came into it definitely by accident. I'm sure that everyone here will have some stories about growing up and loving the environment. I have vacations we would go on, or I worked on a cattle ranch and in the mountains. It was beautiful. Have all those kinds of things that are like rooted in a love and concern for our environment. But I'm not maybe like a traditional environmentalist per se. So it wasn't like always like, oh, I want to do environmental journalism. But I think it just, when I became a journalist, it seemed like some of the best stories that I was doing were ones where it was taking like some sort of urgent thing, fracking, earthquakes, wildfires. I guess there's a couple other science stories that I was doing, and like trying to make them relatable and interesting. And I think that being able to do both those things, to try to be someone who's willing to go into studies and to talk to scientists and be confused and muddle around and try and figure it out, and then come out the other side and try and make it something that's interesting and relatable to everyone, is just not something that it seems like a lot of people want to do. But it was kind of interesting for me, and so I think because of that, some of my best stories were these nuggets of stories that were out there for everyone, but most people didn't, at least the places I was at, didn't want to do that work, and so they ended up being really good. So when I applied for a job in Pittsburgh, I felt like I had some good clips on environmental reporting and thought maybe they would hire me to do that work, and it turned out they did. So I don't know, I kind of backed my way into it, but obviously with those core values of loving, being outside and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, my career in journalism is much shorter than both of yours. However, I began my career as a photojournalist. I mean, I'd been a photographer for many years, and mostly freelancing and living in. I grew up, born and raised in Pittsburgh, and living in Allegheny County. It's very hard to ignore these issues. Even just as a young photojournalist looking for things to report on, things to photograph, I was drawn to a lot of these environmental issues, particularly in the Mon Valley. It's somewhere that I live 15 minutes from. It, like Kara said, it's we breathe that air too. So it's something that impacts me and my family. But when it came time to actually choosing that avenue as a direction of my career, I think climate and environment, climate in particular, is something that's really only going to become more and more relevant. It's the most pressing problem we have as a society, really, and it's impacting pretty much every other issue that we have. Politics, industry, manufacturing, you name it. Everything is going to, in some way, be impacted by climate change. So when I think about what our coverage can bring to that, I think it's really important to recognize the ripple effects of the stories that we do on other stories, and drawing those lines very concretely between okay, this is happening, we know this is happening, but this is also going to affect your lives in X, Y, and Z ways, and that's, I think, how I approach it.
I also kind of backed into environmental journalism. I started volunteering with an indie media group, which is kind of like a group of citizen or community reporters. Different cities had them, and Pittsburgh had one that was centered around radio. And so I started doing volunteer reporting for them about different topics, social justice issues, which is interesting, talking about advocacy and reporting. But it was very much reporting and fair sort of reporting, even though it was sort of started as a social justice movement. And so I did some reporting about marriage equality and all kinds of other issues there. But I did a story about a fish kill in a river, in a creek, and somebody from the Allegheny Front heard it. It was broadcast from another university. It was a weekly show, and said, you should come and do stuff for our show. We're always looking for freelancers still. And so I started reporting, sort of freelancing with them, and eventually became a staff person. But I've always been interested in the environment. I was in high school in the 1990s, and in 1990 there was a big resurgence of Earth Day, and they had a celebration in Point State Park downtown. It was picnic tables. It was very small, but there was all this information about vegetarianism and it was because Earth Day was started it was at 1970. And so it kind of had petered out, and so this was this resurgence of Earth Day or something in the 90s. And so, I started thinking about these. They gave you a tree to plant, and I planted a tree in my yard. It's still there, my parents' yard. And so anyway, I started thinking about these issues, and then when I started working for the Allegheny Front, I just I had always been reading about environmental issues, but I never really thought as much about local environmental issues. And so for like journalism students who are interested in the environment, I would say just read as much as you can and follow your curiosity about the things that are, if you're interested in little critters like salamanders, and there's a lot of to be done, a lot of science and journalism to be done around that, or if you're interested in climate change, or just follow your own curiosity and read as much as you can about the topics that interest you, and sort of gather, as much knowledge as you can before you start reporting, or even just like follow your curiosity in beginning to report on these kinds of issues.
Excellent advice. All right, for this last section, we're going to just allow you guys, it's just some closing statements. Also, can you please let the student body and those that are listening at home, like how you can follow your work, right? So we want to be able to, we want to keep up with this and be informed. So if you can, in your 2 minutes, can you let us know how the best way to follow your work?
We have a website, WESA.fm. That's probably the way that would be most accessible. We also have an app you can download, 90.5 WESA. There's this thing that your parents have like at home. You may still have them in the cars if you go on a car. It's called a radio. You turn this little thing at 90. When the numbers hit 90.5, sometimes my name will come on there. So those are the best ways to follow my work right now. I can't think of what else. Podcasting, actually. Allegheny Front. Sorry, I'm stealing your thunder. They have a podcast, and sometimes I'm on their podcast. We have some podcasts, but my work isn't on it that much.
Yeah, likewise, our website, publicsource.org, that's where most of my work is. A lot of my photography can be found on Instagram, just at my name, Quinn Glabicki, or on Twitter. I'm also on a couple podcasts here and there, but mostly on our website.
Yeah, we have a website, AlleghenyFront.org. All of our stories are there, and also our full show. It's a radio show. That's broadcast here in Pittsburgh on 90.5 on Saturday afternoons, Friday evenings, and sometimes throughout the week our stories are heard on the radio. But you can go to any podcast platform and find the Allegheny Front there. Our weekly show is uploaded as a podcast, and we're on Twitter at Allegheny Front still, and I think Instagram at Allegheny Front. And thanks for having us. Thanks for being interested in the environment and for what's going on around you. It's great.
If anyone is interested to chat about environmental journalism, I'm happy to respond to emails, and my email is quinn@publicsource.org, so feel free to reach out.
Excellent. Again, thank you. On behalf of the Duquesne chapter of the Society of Professional Journalism, this was awesome. Thank you guys so much. There was a lot of good information, a lot of great conversation. To the viewers at home and on Zoom, we appreciate you sticking with us for the hour and a half. And everybody have a wonderful and safe long weekend. Thank you very much.